The first time I noticed something missing was my favorite necklace. A delicate gold-plated memory that my grandmother had left me before she passed away. At that moment, I thought maybe I had misplaced it, a simple oversight. But as the weeks passed, other items began to disappear. A designer bag she had saved for months, a bottle of perfume barely taken out of its box, even a pair of expensive heels she had only worn once. I lived with my husband Eric in his parents' family home on the outskirts of Madrid. Her mother, Helena, had recently moved with us after selling her own house downtown. The apartment was spacious, with large windows that overlooked a small garden, but somehow it felt smaller since she arrived. Helena was charming in public and always seemed to have an air of sophistication. With her perfectly combed grey hair and impeccable suits, she was the living image of a lady from Madrid's high society. However, his charm often faded behind closed doors. He had a habit of overstepping boundaries, rearranging my things, and making disparaging comments about my minimalist style when I asked him why he moved my items around. "Oh, honey," he said with a condescending smile, "I'm just trying to breathe some life into this place. Don't you think it's a little dull?" His words were always accompanied by a hand gesture, as if he were swatting away an invisible fly. Through it all, I tried to stay polite. I didn't want to cause unnecessary tension with my husband. Eric adored his mother and always defended her, even when it was obvious she had gone too far. "It's her way," she told me, "you know how mothers are." But the truth was bubbling beneath the surface. My things weren't being lost, they were being stolen. My suspicions grew when I found a receipt for a luxury handbag stuffed in the trash. It wasn't mine, but the purchase date coincided with the disappearance of my designer bag. Coincidence or a hidden habit? Confronting Helena was not easy. One afternoon, while we were having tea on the terrace, I casually mentioned the missing necklace. She adopted an expression of utter offense, as if she had accused a saint of sinning. "Why would I need your trinkets when I have my own collection?" he scoffed. I felt a pang of anger, but I bit my tongue. I didn't want to fight, and part of me still wanted to believe it was all a misunderstanding. The following days were torture. Every time I walked into a room and saw Helena, I felt like she was watching me, waiting for my reaction. I began storing my most precious things in a safe that I had secretly purchased. It was small, barely the size of a book, but it gave me a certain peace of mind. One night while we were having dinner, Eric commented how pretty he thought the new necklace his mother was wearing. My heart skipped a beat when I saw it. It was identical to mine, the one that had disappeared. Helena smiled pleased and said that she had bought it at El Corte Inglés a few days ago. I felt my blood boil, but how could I accuse her without evidence? The disappearances continued. One day it was a pair of earrings, the next a silk scarf that my best friend had given me. I began to feel paranoid, constantly going through my belongings, counting and recounting. The atmosphere at home became tense. Eric noticed my concern but seemed unable to understand the seriousness of the situation. "You're overreacting," she told me one night as she watched me reorganize my closet for the umpteenth time. "Mom wouldn't do something like that. Maybe you're working too hard and the stress is getting to you." I worked as a teacher at a nearby high school, and although my job could be stressful at times, I knew I wasn't imagining things. I decided to take more drastic measures. I bought a small hidden camera and placed it strategically in my bedroom. I felt guilty for resorting to such extremes, but I needed proof. Days passed without anything happening. I was starting to think that maybe Eric was right and it was all in my head. But then one afternoon while reviewing the recording, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Helena came into our room while we were gone, went straight to my jewelry box and started rummaging through it. I saw her take out a pair of earrings that my mother had given me at my wedding and put them in her pocket. With shaking hands, I downloaded the video to my phone. He had the proof he needed, but what was he going to do with it? Confront Helena? Show it to Eric? The fear of his reaction paralyzed me. What if he didn't believe me? What if he took his mother's side? I decided to wait and watch. Perhaps, I thought naively, if I gathered more evidence, the situation would be so clear that no one could deny it. But with each passing day I felt more trapped, more helpless. My home, which should have been my refuge, had become a silent battlefield. One morning, while we were having breakfast, Helena appeared wearing a dress that looked familiar to me. With horror, I realized it was one of my own, one I thought I had lost weeks ago. I had altered it slightly, shortening the hem and changing the buttons, but there was no doubt that it was mine. "What a pretty dress, Mom," Eric commented with a smile. "It suits you very well." Helena smiled pleased. "Thank you, honey. I found it in a small boutique in the Salamanca neighborhood. It was quite a bargain." I felt something break inside me. I could no longer remain silent. With a shaky voice, I said, "That dress is mine, Helena. I bought it months ago and it disappeared from my closet." The silence that followed was deafening. Eric looked at me in disbelief, while Helena adopted an expression of theatrical shock. "How dare you?" he exclaimed. "Are you implying that I robbed you?" "How outrageous!" Eric intervened, trying to calm the waters. "Come on, honey, it must be a misunderstanding. I'm sure they're similar dresses." But I couldn't contain myself anymore. I pulled out my phone and, with trembling hands, played the video I had recorded. As the pictures progressed, I watched the color drain from Eric's face and Helena become speechless for the first time since I'd known her. When the video ended, the silence in the kitchen was absolute. I could hear the ticking of the clock on the wall, the distant hum of traffic on the street. Eric was the first to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mom, what have you done?" Helena began to cry, big tears that ruined her perfect makeup. "You don't understand," he sobbed. "I felt so alone, so insignificant. I wanted to feel young again, beautiful." While Eric comforted his mother, I stood there, stunned. I had won, in a way, but I didn't feel victorious. I felt empty, betrayed not only by Helena, but also by Eric, who for so long had refused to see the truth. That night, as I lay awake in bed, with Eric snoring softly next to me, I realized this was just the beginning. We had uncovered a Pandora's box, and the consequences of this revelation would shake the foundations of our family. But for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe freely in my own home. Whatever tomorrow brought, at least the truth was finally out. The days that followed the confrontation with Helena were like walking on broken glass. The atmosphere at home was tense, full of furtive glances and awkward silences. Eric seemed lost, torn between his loyalty to his mother and his duty as my husband. Helena, for her part, had adopted the role of victim, sobbing dramatically every time someone mentioned the incident. One morning, while eating breakfast alone in the kitchen, I decided I needed to do something else. I couldn't continue living like this, in a constant state of alert. I made a decision. I was going to investigate on my own. If Helena had been able to steal my things, what else could she be hiding? I waited for Helena to go out to her usual Pilates class in the center of Madrid. As soon as I saw her leave, with her gym bag on her shoulder and her huge sunglasses, I went up the stairs to her room. My heart was pounding as I turned the doorknob. Part of me felt guilty for invading her privacy, but another part, the one that had been betrayed and manipulated, urged me to move on. Helena's room was a perfect reflection of herself, elegant, tidy, and with a touch of extravagance. The cream silk curtains let in soft light that illuminated the mahogany dresser and the dresser filled with expensive beauty products. I went directly to the closet, an imposing piece of furniture that took up an entire wall. As I opened the doors, I gasped. The closet was filled with designer clothes, stilettos, and luxury brand handbags. I immediately recognized several of my missing items, but what struck me most was the amount of new stuff. Dresses with labels from exclusive stores in the Salamanca neighborhood, shoes from Italian brands that cost more than my monthly salary, bags that I had only seen in fashion magazines. With trembling hands, I began going through the drawers. In one of them, hidden under a pile of silk scarves, I found a bulging envelope. I opened it and it almost fell out of my hands. It was full of €500 bills. Along with the money, there were several receipts from pawn shops in the center of Madrid. To my horror, I recognized the description of some of my jewelry on those papers. As I was trying to process what I was seeing, I heard a noise downstairs. Panic overwhelmed me. Had Helena returned? Or was it Eric who had returned early from work? With my heart in my throat, I quickly put everything away and left the room, carefully closing the door behind me. I walked down the stairs trying to look casual, only to come face to face with Eric. He was standing in the hallway, his suit rumpled and a tired expression on his face. "What are you doing home so early?" I asked, trying to make my voice sound normal. Eric looked at me with narrowed eyes. "I forgot some important documents." "What about you? Shouldn't you be at school?" I quickly lied, saying I wasn't feeling well and had asked for the day off. Eric nodded absent-mindedly and walked up the stairs to our bedroom. I stood there, feeling the weight of what I had just discovered crushing me. That night, while Eric was showering, I gathered the courage to confront him. When he emerged from the bathroom, wrapped in a cloud of steam and with a towel around his waist, I told him we needed to talk. "Eric," I began, my voice shaking slightly, "I've discovered something about your mother that I think you need to know." I told her everything I had seen in Helena's room, the expensive clothes, the jewelry, the hidden money, the receipts from the pawn shops. As he spoke, I watched Eric's expression go from disbelief to shock to anger. "Did you come into my mother's room?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. "How dare you invade her privacy like that?" I was stunned. Of all the possible reactions, this was the one I least expected. "Is that all you care about?" I asked, incredulous. "Haven't you listened to anything I've told you? Your mother hasn't just been stealing from me, she's selling my stuff." Eric ran a hand through his damp hair, a gesture he always did when he was frustrated. "I can't believe you did this," he said. "My mother has her flaws, but she would never do something like that. There must be an explanation." I felt anger rising inside me. An explanation? What explanation can there be for having an envelope full of hidden money and pawnshop receipts with a description of my jewelry? Eric dressed quietly, avoiding looking at me. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded tired and defeated. "Look, I know things have been tense lately, but this is too much. If you have a problem with my mother, maybe you should consider moving away for a while." His words hit me like a slap. "Move?" I repeated, incredulously. "Are you asking me to leave my own house because your mother is a thief?" "Don't call her that," Eric growled. "She's my mother, for God's sake. If you can't respect that, then maybe we should reconsider our situation." I was speechless. The man in front of me, the man I had married and thought I knew, was choosing to defend his mother despite all the evidence. I felt something break inside me, a crack opening in the foundation of our marriage. "Okay," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "If that's what you want, I'll leave. But don't think for a second that it ends here." That night, I slept on the living room couch, too hurt and angry to share a bed with Eric. The next morning, while I was making coffee in the kitchen, Helena walked in, dressed in an elegant outfit that I recognized as one of the new ones I had seen in her closet. "Good morning, dear," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Did you sleep well?" I stared at her, unable to hide my contempt. "Cut the drama, Helena. I know what you've been doing." His smile faltered for a moment, but quickly recovered. "I don't know what you're talking about," he replied with feigned innocence. "I know everything," I said, my voice shaking with suppressed rage. "The robberies, the sales, the hidden money. Everything." Helena looked at me for a long moment, and then, to my surprise, she burst out laughing. It was not a happy laugh, but cold and calculating. "Oh, honey," she said, shaking her head as if I were a little girl who didn't understand anything. "And what are you going to do about it? Tell Eric. You've already tried that, right? And look where you are now, sleeping on the couch while I'm still here." I felt my blood boil. "This won't stay like this," I warned. "I'll find a way to expose you for who you really are." Helena approached me, her expensive perfume flooding my senses. "Listen to me carefully," he whispered, all pretense of kindness gone from his voice. "This is my house. Eric is my son. You are expendable. If you know what's good for you, you'll pack your things and leave before things get really bad." With that, he grabbed a cup of coffee and left the kitchen, leaving me shaking with rage and helplessness. At that moment, I knew I was at war. A war for my marriage, for my home, for my dignity. And she was determined to win, no matter the cost. The next few days were silent torture. I moved around the house like a ghost, avoiding Helena and barely speaking to Eric. Nights on the couch had become my new normal, and the knot in my stomach seemed to have settled permanently. But life, as always, had other plans. One morning, chaos broke out in our house in a way no one expected. I woke up to the sound of drawers violently opening and closing, followed by muffled curses. Half asleep, I got up from the couch and headed toward the source of the commotion, our bedroom. Upon entering, I found a surreal scene. Eric, normally so composed, was in the middle of a whirlwind of laundry, owing suits, shirts, and pants everywhere. His face was red with frustration and beads of sweat beaded his forehead. "What's going on?" I asked, still groggy from sleep. Eric turned to me, his eyes flashing with a mix of panic and anger. "My suit," he growled. "My best Armani suit. It's gone. I need it for the gala tonight. Where the hell is it?" The irony of the situation was not lost on me. After weeks of ignoring my complaints about missing items, Eric was now experiencing firsthand what it felt like. A mean part of me wanted to laugh in his face, but I stopped myself. "I don't know," I replied calmly. "When was the last time you saw him?" "I left it hanging here," he said, pointing to an empty space in the closet. "I was prepared for the company gala. It's the most important event of the year and now, damn." As Eric continued his frantic search, I remained silent, watching. He knew exactly what had happened, or rather, who was responsible. But this time, I decided not to say anything. I wanted to see how it all played out. After half an hour of fruitless searching, Eric collapsed on the bed, defeated. "I don't understand," he muttered. "It can't have just disappeared like that." It was at that moment when I decided to drop the bomb. "Your mother sold it," I said simply. Eric's head snapped up, his eyes boring into me with a mixture of disbelief and horror. "What? No, that's impossible. She would never. Would I never do something like that?" I completed his sentence. "Eric, how many times do I have to tell you? Your mother has been stealing and selling things for months now. My things, your things, anything she can turn into quick money." I watched as reality began to set in on his face. The denial he had maintained for so long was beginning to crack. Without another word, he stood up and left the room. I followed him, knowing exactly where he was going. Eric barged into Helena's room without even knocking. She was sitting at her dressing table, meticulously applying her morning makeup. Seeing us enter, he raised an eyebrow in surprise. "Eric, honey, what's wrong?" she asked with feigned innocence. "My suit, Mom," Eric said, his voice shaking with suppressed rage. "Where's my Armani suit?" Helena blinked, confused. "Your suit? I don't know what you're talking about, dear." "Don't lie to me," Eric growled. "I know you've been stealing things. The suit I need for tonight's gala is missing. What did you do with it?" I saw how Helena's face changed. The mask of innocence slipped, revealing an expression of cold calculation. "Oh, that old thing," he said with a dismissive gesture. "You never used it anyway. I thought it might be of better use." Eric's jaw dropped. "You sold it. How could you?" Helena stood up, facing her son. "I needed some extra money for tonight's gala. You can always buy another suit, right? Besides, isn't that what families do? Share." The tension in the room was palpable. He could see Eric struggling internally, his loyalty to his mother clashing violently with the reality of his actions. Finally, it exploded. "This isn't sharing, Mom. It's stealing. You've been stealing from me and my wife for months. How could you do this to us?" Helena, to my surprise, did not show an ounce of remorse. Instead, he let out a bitter laugh. "Oh, please, Eric. Don't be so dramatic. I was just taking what I deserve. After all, who do you think paid for this house? Who raised you? Who sacrificed everything for you?" Eric recoiled as if he had been slapped. "That doesn't give you the right to steal," he said, but his voice no longer had the same conviction. I decided to intervene. "Helena, this has to stop. You can't keep living here and treating us like we're your personal box." Helena turned to me, her eyes shining with malice. "And who's going to stop me?" "You. Eric will never choose an upstart like you over his own mother." I felt my blood boil, but before I could respond, Eric spoke. "Stop it, Mom. This is over. I want you to leave this house." The silence that followed was deafening. Helena looked at Eric, then at me, and back at Eric. For the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. "You're not serious," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've never been more serious," Eric replied. "You have until tomorrow to pack your things and leave." Helena began to cry, big tears that ruined her perfect makeup. "But Eric, I'm your mother. You can't do this to me. Where will I go?" "You should have thought of that before stealing and lying," I said, unable to contain my satisfaction. "I'm sure you'll find a place. After all, you must have quite a bit of money saved from all the things you've sold." Eric took my hand and led me out of the room, leaving Helena sobbing dramatically. Once in the hallway, he collapsed against the wall, burying his face in his hands. "I'm sorry," he murmured. "I'm so sorry. I should have believed you from the beginning." I wanted to be mad at him. I wanted to yell at him for all the times he had made me doubt myself, for all the nights I had spent on the couch. But seeing him like this, so vulnerable and remorseful, I felt my anger fade. "It's okay," I said softly, putting a hand on his shoulder. "The important thing is that now you know. We can get through this together." Eric looked up, his eyes filling with tears. "How can you forgive me so easily?" "It's not easy," I admitted. "But I love you, and I know your mother manipulated you as much as she manipulated me. We're going to need time to heal, but we'll get there." We stayed like that for a moment, holding each other in the hallway, listening to Helena's increasingly quiet sobs in the next room. I knew that this was not the end, but just the beginning of a new chapter in our lives. We had a lot to resolve, a lot of trust to rebuild. But for the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of hope. That night's gala was forgotten. Instead, we spent the evening talking, really talking, for the first time in what seemed like forever. We share our fears, our frustrations, our hopes for the future. And while I knew the road ahead would be difficult, I also knew that, together, we could face anything. As I fell asleep that night, back in our bed, with Eric by my side, I thought about how a simple missing suit had been the catalyst to unmasking years of manipulation and deception. Sometimes, I reflected, it is in loss where we find our true strength. The days that followed the confrontation with Helena were like walking on thin ice. The tension in the house was palpable, and the silence deafening. Helena had barricaded herself in her room, coming out only for meals, where her presence was like a bitter ghost floating over the table. Eric, for his part, seemed to be in a constant state of internal conflict. I watched him fight every day, his loyalty divided between his mother and me. Sometimes I found him looking at old family photos, his eyes full of nostalgia and confusion. Other times, I caught him looking at Helena with a mixture of pain and disappointment on his face. One morning, while we were eating breakfast in silence, Eric finally spoke. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice hoarse from lack of use. "I think we should look for the things that went missing." I nodded slowly, grateful that he was finally taking the initiative. "Where do you want to start?" I asked softly. "By his room," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know it's an invasion of your privacy, but—" "Eric," I interrupted, "she invaded our privacy first. She stole our things. You don't have to feel guilty about this." He nodded, although I could see the guilt still weighing on his shoulders. Together, we headed to Helena's room. She was out for her usual yoga class, which gave us a couple of hours to search. Upon entering, the room seemed strangely normal. The bed was perfectly made, the curtains drawn let in the Madrid morning light. But we knew that secrets were hidden beneath that facade of normality. "We start with the closet." Eric opened the doors with trembling hands and we both gasped. There, hanging among her own clothes, were several of my missing dresses. On the floor, I recognized my favorite shoes, those that I thought had been lost months ago. "Oh my God," Eric murmured, running a hand over his face. All this time they were here." We continue searching. In the drawers we found more of my belongings, jewelry, scarves, even a watch Eric thought he'd lost on a business trip. But the most shocking thing was what we found at the back of the closet, a shoe box full of receipts from pawn shops and thrift stores. Eric took one of the receipts, his eyes scanning the paper. This is the necklace I gave you on our anniversary," he said, his voice breaking. "He sold it for just a fraction of its value." I approached him, putting a hand on his shoulder. I could feel him trembling under my touch. "Eric, I'm so sorry," I said softly. She turned to me, her eyes filled with unshed tears. "No, I'm sorry. I should have believed you from the beginning. How could I be so blind?" Just then, we heard the front door open. Helena had returned. We quickly tried to put everything in its place, but it was too late. She appeared in the doorway of his room, her face transforming from surprise to anger in a matter of seconds. "What are you doing here?" he shouted. "Get out of my room." Eric stood up, facing his mother. "No, Mom. Enough of the lies. We found everything. The things you stole, the sales receipts. How could you do this to us?" Helena seemed to deflate before our eyes. The mask of indignation slipped from her face, revealing a frightened and desperate woman. "You don't understand," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "After your father left, after we sold the house, I felt so alone, so useless. I wanted to feel young again, important." Eric shook his head in disbelief. "And stealing from your own family was the solution? Lying and manipulating us?" "I didn't mean for things to go this far," Helena sobbed. "It started with little things, and then I just couldn't stop." I watched silently as mother and son faced each other, years of secrets and resentments rising to the surface. Part of me wanted to intervene, but I knew this was something they had to work out between them. "Mom," Eric finally said, his voice firm but compassionate. "I love you, but this can't go on. You need help." Helena nodded weakly, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I know," he whispered. "I know." The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Eric contacted a therapist who specialized in kleptomania and addictions. I dedicated myself to recovering my belongings and trying to track down those that had been sold. It was a painful and exhausting process, but necessary. Helena, for her part, seemed a shadow of the woman she had been. I watched her struggle with shame and regret, sometimes unable to look us in the eye during meals. But I also saw glimpses of the woman Eric had always described, loving, fun, full of life. It was as if, with the weight of secrets lifted, a part of her had begun to resurface. One night, while Eric and I were sitting on the couch, idly watching television, he took my hand. "Thank you," he said simply. I looked at him, confused. "Because?" "For not giving up on me," he replied. "For being patient when I was a blind idiot. For being here now." I felt tears gathering in my eyes. "I love you," I said. "That means being there in the good times and the bad." We hugged each other in silence, letting the weight of the past few months slowly dissolve. I knew we had a long road ahead of us. Trust, once broken, cannot be repaired overnight. But for the first time in a long time, I felt hope. The healing process was slow and not always easy. There were days when anger and resentment threatened to drown me. Days when I questioned if we could really get through this. But there were also moments of light, the first time Helena sincerely apologized to me, without excuses or justifications. The night Eric and I had a long conversation about trust and communication, laughing and crying in equal measure. Little by little, our house began to feel like a home again. Helena began to make progress in her therapy, facing the demons that had led to her actions. Eric and I worked on rebuilding our relationship, learning to trust and support each other again. One afternoon, while the three of us were drinking coffee on the terrace, enjoying the spring sun of Madrid, Helena spoke. "I want you to know," she said, her voice trembling but determined, "that I am deeply sorry for all the hurt I have caused. I know words are not enough, but I am committed to earning your trust again, one day at a time." Eric and I exchanged a look. It had been a difficult road, full of potholes and unexpected curves. But we were here, together, facing the future with honesty and hope. "We know, Mom," Eric said softly. "And we are here to support you." As the sun set over the rooftops of Madrid, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't experienced in months. The fracture in loyalty that had threatened to destroy our family was slowly healing. It wouldn't be a quick or easy process, but we were on the right track. That night, as I prepared for bed, I reflected on how sometimes the most painful crises can take us to places of growth and understanding we could never have imagined. Loyalty, I learned, is not about blindness or denial, but about love, honesty, and the willingness to face even the most difficult truths together. As the weeks passed, the tension in the house seemed to gradually decrease. Helena had started her therapy and, although the process was slow and painful, we were seeing small changes in her behavior. However, the apparent calm turned out to be only the prelude to an even bigger storm. One Saturday afternoon, while Eric and I enjoyed a walk through the Retiro Park, we received an alarming call from our neighbor, Dona Carmen. With an agitated voice, he informed us that he had seen Helena leave home with several bags and get on a taxi. We ran back home, our hearts beating hard. Upon entering, we find a bleak scenario. Helena's room was completely empty, and when she checked the house, we discovered that she had taken not only her belongings, but also several of our value things. Eric collapsed on the couch, his face a mask of disbelief and pain. "I can't believe it," he murmured. "After everything we have passed, after all the opportunities we gave him." I was furious. The betrayal felt like a stab in the heart. All the words of repentance, all promises of change. Were it just an performance to lower our defenses? While Eric called the police to report the robbery, I checked the house in search of clues about Helena's whereabouts. It was then that I found a note at the kitchen table. With trembling hands, I read it aloud. "Eric, dear. I'm sorry, but I can't keep living like this. This life of restrictions and guilt is not for me. I need my freedom, my independence. I know you will not understand now, but one day I hope you can forgive me. Don't try to look for me. With love, Mom." Eric listened silently, his face a mixture of contradictory emotions. When I finished reading, he got up abruptly and went to the balcony. I followed him, worried. "Eric, I'm very sorry," I said gently, putting a hand on his shoulder. He turned to me, his bright eyes of contained tears. "Do you know what the worst is?" he said in a broken voice. "A part of me always knew that this could happen. I always knew that my mother was complicated. But I refused to see him. I refused to accept it." I hugged him strongly, feeling how I trembled in my arms. "It's not your fault," I whispered. "You did everything you could. You gave you all the opportunities in the world." We spent the following days in a whirlwind of emotions and activities. The police took our statements, but warned us that, since Helena was a family member and had lived in the house, it would be difficult to process the case as a conventional robbery. Meanwhile, Eric immersed himself in a frantic search. He called all the friends and family he could think, reviewed the records of hotels and car rentals, even hired a private detective. I watched it with a mixture of admiration and concern, fearing that this obsession could consume it. One night, while we had dinner in silence, Eric released his cutlery with frustration. "I don't understand it," he said. "How can someone simply disappear like this? It's as if the earth had swallowed." I took his hand on the table. "Eric, perhaps, maybe it's time to consider the possibility that she doesn't want to be found." I saw how the reality of my words settled on his face. "But she's my mother," he said weakly. "How can I simply give up it?" "You are not renouncing," I replied softly. "You are accepting your decision, however painful it is." The days became weeks, and the weeks in months. Little by little, Helena's absence became a new normality. The wound of his departure was still there, but he was no longer constantly bleeding. However, just when we thought we had left everything behind, the past hit us again. One afternoon, while we saw the local news, a report captured our attention. He showed images of an elegant party in a luxury hotel on the Costa del Sol. And there, in the middle of the crowd, he was Helena, radiant in a designer dress, laughing and socializing as if he did not have a concern in the world. Eric was paralyzed, his eyes fixed on the screen. I felt that anger invaded me. How could he be there, living the great life, after all the pain he had caused us? "I'm going," Eric said suddenly, getting up from the couch. What? Where? I asked, although I already knew the answer. To Marbella. I'm going to find her and demand answers. I tried to reason with him, make him see that confronting her would only bring more pain, but his mind was determined. Finally, I agreed to accompany him, fearing what I could do if he was going alone. The trip to Marbella was tense. Eric barely spoke, his mind clearly focused on the meeting that awaited us. I, for my part, oscillate between the concern for Eric and anger towards Helena. When we arrived at the hotel, we went directly to the bar, where the report had shown that the party was developed. And there she was, sitting at a table surrounded by people, laughing and drinking champagne as if she didn't have a single concern in the world. Eric approached the table, his body tense like a violin rope about to break. "Mom," he said, his voice just a whisper. Helena turned, and for a moment, I saw the shock and fear cross her face. But he quickly rebuked, adopting a forced smile. "Eric, dear. What a surprise, so unexpected." "Unexpected?" Eric's voice trembled with contained emotion. "This is how you describe to see your son to leave and stole?" Helena's table colleagues remained uncomfortable, some even got up and moved away discreetly. Helena, however, maintained her composure. "Eric, love, I think you are exaggerating a little. Why don't we sit down and talk quietly?" But Eric was no longer willing to play his game. "No, Mom. The lies are over, manipulations end. I want the truth. Now." Helena looked around, clearly uncomfortable with the scene that was being developed in public. Finally, with a resigned sigh, he got up. "It's fine, let's go to my room. We'll talk there." Once in the suite. Once in the Helena suite, the atmosphere tightened even more. The luxury that surrounded us contrasted painfully with the emotional emptiness we felt. Helena sat in an elegant armchair, while Eric and I stood up, unable to relax in that environment that shouted opulence and carefree. "Well," said Helena, crossing his legs and looking at us with a mixture of challenge and tiredness. "What do you want to know?" Eric took a step forward, his tight fists on the sides. "Everything," he demanded. "I want to know why you stole us, why you abandoned us, why you are living here as if nothing had happened while I." His voice broke, unable to continue. Helena sighed deeply, as if she were about to explain something very simple to a stubborn child. "Eric, honey, life is not white or black. Sometimes, people do things that others do not understand because they don't see the complete picture." "And what is that complete panorama, Helena?" he intervened, unable to contain my frustration. "What possible justification can you have to hurt your own family?" Helena's eyes stuck into me, cold and calculators. "You," he said with disdain, "you would never understand it. You've never had to sacrifice for anyone. I gave the best years of my life to my family, my son. And what did I get in return? A mediocre life in the suburbs, seeing how my dreams faded day after day." Eric seemed stunned by his mother's words. "But Mom," he said weakly, "I always thought you were happy with us." "You never said." "What was supposed to say?" Helena interrupted. "What did I regret having formed a family? What did I yearn for a different life? No, love. I did what I expected of me. I was the perfect mother, the perfect wife. But inside I was dying." A heavy silence fell on the room. He could see how Helena's words hit Eric as stabs, destroying the image she had always had of her mother and her childhood. "That doesn't justify what you did," I finally said, breaking the silence. "Rob, lie, manipulate. Do you think you are the only person in the world who has had to sacrifice their dreams? There are ways to change your life without destroying those around you." Helena rose abruptly, her calm mask disappearing. "And who are you to judge me? You came to our lives and suddenly everything revolved around you. The perfect daughter-in-law, the perfect wife. Do you think I didn't see how you were moving? How did you take over my place?" Eric took a step between us, his face a mixture of pain and determination. "Enough," he said in a firm voice. "Mom, what you are saying, what you have done, it has no justification. I gave you all the opportunities to change, to do things well. But this is too much." I saw how Helena changed her strategy, Her eyes filled with false tears. Eric, love, you can't talk to me like this. I am your mother. Everything I have done for you, for your good. But this time, Eric did not fall in his trap. No, he said, his voice trembling slightly. No more manipulations, Mom. It is over. You have to decide right now, or you are honest with us, you return what you stole and accept the consequences of your actions, or this ends here and now. Forever. The ultimatum floated in the air, heavy and definitive. Helena looked at her son, then to me, and again to Eric. For a moment, I thought I saw a flash of repentance in his eyes, but he vanished so fast that he could have imagined it. Are you giving me an ultimatum? He asked, his voice mixing disbelief and contempt. To your own mother? Eric nodded, his face a determination mask. Yes, I'm doing it. Because I can't keep living like this anymore, Mom. I can't keep doubting every word you say, fearing every time you disappear. I need to know that I can trust you, that you really want to be part of our lives from a healthy way. Helena was silent for what seemed an eternity. I could see the emotions fighting on his face: pride, fear, anger, maybe even a glimpse of love. Finally, he spoke, his voice just a whisper. I can't come back, Eric. I can't go back to that life. I'm sorry, but this is me. This is the life I want. The words fell like a slab among us. I saw how Eric collapsed, all the hope he had kept so far evaporating in an instant. I understand, he finally said, his voice hoarse for the emotion contained. Then I suppose this is goodbye. Helena made a movement as if she wanted to approach her son, but stopped. Eric, it doesn't have to be like that. We can keep the contact. I can visit them from time to time. But Eric was already shaking his head. No, Mom. It doesn't work like that. You can't enter and get out of our lives when you please. You can't take whatever you want and then disappear. Or you are completely with us, or you are not at all. I saw how the reality of the situation settled in Helena's face. For the first time since he knew her, she seemed truly affected, as if she finally understood the weight of her actions and decisions. Sorry, he said finally, and for once, he sounded sincere. I'm very sorry, Eric. I never wanted to hurt you. Eric nodded, silent tears running down his cheeks. I know, Mom. I feel it too. With that, he took my hand and headed towards the door. Before leaving, he stopped and looked at his mother one last time. Goodbye, Mom. I hope you find what you are looking for. We left the room and the hotel in silence, the weight of what had just happened crushing us. It wasn't until we were back in our rented car that Eric finally collapsed, sobbing as a child. I hugged him strongly, feeling how years of pain and disappointment came out in waves. The return trip to Madrid was silent, each lost in his own thoughts. He knew that Eric was processing the end of the relationship with his mother, a wound that would take a long time to heal, if he ever did it completely. When we finally get home, we found it strangely quiet and cozy. It was as if, when this painful chapter of our lives closed, we would have released a weight that we did not even know that we loaded. That night, while we were lying in bed, Eric spoke softly in the dark. Thank you, he said. Why? I asked, intertwining my fingers with his. Being there. For not taking me with me. For helping me see the truth, even when it was painful. I turned to look at him, seeing vulnerability in his eyes. We are a team, I reminded him. In good and bad. He nodded, a little smile forming on his lips. We are, he agreed. And I think it's time for us to start thinking about our future. Only we two. I understood what I wanted to say. It was time to leave the past behind, to build something new and beautiful from the ashes of what we had lost. The days and weeks that followed were not easy. There were times when Eric plunged into sadness, remembering happy moments of his childhood and wondering if they had been real or only other manipulation of Helena. There were days when rage consumed him, cursing his mother for the pain he had caused us. But little by little, day by day, we were healing. We support each other, we share our fears and hopes, and slowly we begin to rebuild our life together. 6 months after our trip to Marbella, we discovered that we were waiting for our first child. The news was like a sunbeam after a long storm. While Eric put his hand on my belly still flat, I saw in his eyes a mixture of joy and determination. "We are going to do well," he promised. "We are going to create the family that we always want to have." And so, while we closed a painful chapter of our lives, we prepared to start a new one, full of hope and possibilities. The final ultimatum had not been just for Helena, we realized. It had been for us too. An ultimatum to let the past go, to choose happiness and love over pain and resentment. While looking at Eric, I felt a wave of love and gratitude. We had gone through the fire together and we had left stronger. And now, with a brilliant future ahead, we were ready to write our own history, one page at the same time.